Hello everyone. Today we're going to be looking at what if civilization started over, part 3. Firstly, a revolution happened over here with the green people over here, or the green team. Now the green dynasty, which is the name of this, takes this part and continues the revolt. Now the Chinese over here don't really know that this is happening, and because of that their military hasn't intervened. However, when the green team gets closer to the capital of China, which is over here, the Chinese understand what is happening, so they send troops over here. Firstly, this small attack starts, which then the Chinese ambush over here, and start taking away these lands. However, suddenly, the green team gets supported by the Japanese, which ends up taking down these small areas over here. Now then again, if from the whole series, this is actually the best area as it has the least amount of nuclear reaction. So Thailand and and a part of Malaysia gets taken down. The Chinese surrender. Now it has been seen that the Green Dynasty over here has taken most of the Chinese lands, except for this part, which is the most important part of the original yellow team. Now, anyways, let's go over here, where you can see the collapse of the Iberian Empire. Now, firstly, we have the UK is striking again, taking down these territories, or almost about to reach the Iberian Union's capital, which is over here in Madrid. Then a revolt happens over here. Wait, that's too familiar. I'm just gonna do that. Yeah, of course, it's different. So, anyways, the French appear over here in this part, and they get Paris, which then they unite most of the French territories. Yeah, it looks like about it. They then take down these territories, meaning that this is now French territory. Then the Italians strike. With their imperial stage over here, which the reason why I'm saying imperial stage is because they actually take down this part of Tunisia over here, which they then expand over here. With some dedication, Greece then appears into the map, taking these territories right here. Now the new empire is actually really happy about it, as they could use it as an advantage to take down these Iberian lands over here in Africa, meaning that the new empire over here will end up being the strongest empire there is ever. Now then the collapse over here was from tribal people over here that were trying to take away all of the all of the Iberian lands over here, which ends up being successful, taking down these areas over here. Now, the Iberian Union had no choice but to take away all of their colonies right here. Taking down the empire and thus creating a lost empire. Now, meanwhile, we can actually see the new empire coming back with these territories over here. However, the thing is that the Italians are actually pretty mad because the wait a minute, that color is kind of cool. I could put it into a country. Speaking of which, a country is over here created, and they have a revolution with the new empire, which, as it turns out, they actually win it. So they then take away all of these territories from the new empire, and meanwhile the Madagascar people are actually break friendship with the new empire. The Indian revolts over here are created. Mostly because wait a minute, that reminds me of a certain nation. Oh my god! Wait a minute. Okay, let's just do this type of color. So, anyways, yeah, the Indians end up having a revolt, which is successful, which they actually take these territories, which actually reminds me of actual India, but if it was actually the strongest nation there was instead of America, which we'll get on to the USA for a bit. However, yeah, the Indians end up revolting and they win, just like the Turkish. Now, this actually surprised, well, most of the world, because they didn't expect the new empire to be the worst empire there was because of these two revolts. However, then again, the Iberian Union had the biggest loss because when you think about it, it was actually a culturally different nation. However, they didn't actually split the nation into parts. They just stayed. So yeah. However, you could say the same with the British, because there's the Scottish, the English, the Welsh, the Irish over here. Technically Scottish, like historically, like in Northern Ireland. And then we have Icelandic people over here. However, over here we can actually see like a bunch of more different people over here. So because of that, the empire slows down. Which, because of tribal areas, people end up the British end up abandoning most of their African territories over here. They also want to bring back Nigeria, which they do. Only having the southern portion. They then create they then eventually create the northern version, the northern part over here. Now let's go to America, where you could actually see something interesting. Now remember let's just say the original Cuban people, which are now in Florida. Well, now they're ending up to create colonies over here. going as far as over here. They then take away these lands, which in our presents to me a certain nation that I'm not gonna talk about because y'all already know what it is. It's the Americans. Now the Florida people over here, ended up being the USA, which is actually called America now. Now I might actually realize that Southern America over here doesn't have enough countries like the rest of the world has. However, that's actually because Southern America, since there's a rainforest over here, people that are trying to invade this area don't come back to their nations. So yeah. Meanwhile, a revolt happened over here in Cuba. Now, this revolt was actually created by these guys. So, because of that, both the Brazilian country over here and the Peru country over here decided to declare war on Florida, thus creating the First American War. Now, firstly, the Cubans take down these territories over here, also taking down this part. They then attack this region of the Bahamas, and also the rest of the countries. But yeah, then they take down these two, and then they take Puerto Rico. That's not actually Puerto Rico. Yeah, I think that's Puerto Rico. Yeah, that's the Dominican and the Haiti Republic. Yeah. They then take down these territories. However, for once, the Brazilians are actually cooking because they now take this area and then they attack this area. They then regain most of their older territories, including an extra nation named Jamaica, of course. So they end up taking these territories. However, they asked the Peru country if they want to have their territories. However, they said no. So because of that, the Brazilians are actually, taking away the Florida people away. Now this might come to a surprise to you, but let's just say Miami, which is the capital of the USA in this scenario, gets taken away. However, then they invent a new capital city over here, which is awfully named after a certain city or town that was abandoned by the British. Jamestown. I'm talking about Jamestown. So however, they created like a couple miles or like something. I don't know. Sorry, I don't have American geography. I mean, I do know history, but so yeah, basically, the Brazilians end up cooking for once. However, the Florida people end up cooking them, taking down these territories, and making the world what it used to be, except for Cuba. Don't worry. However, I'm not actually gonna pause the video because of the treaty, because yeah, that's right. The Florida people finally got their original lands. Not only that, but they get Jamaica, which they also used to have, in fact. They end up taking the Bahamas, which I don't really remember, but yeah. However, the thing is that they abandoned Florida. Well, at least this part, because the Florida over here, there's a Florida over here. However, they end up regaining Florida. Now then we're going to go to Russia, which is kind of interesting because from the Caspian War, they also got an advantage with the new empire over here. Now since they are really strong, or the Russians, since the Russians are strong, they end up let's just say having an attack, which they successfully do, bordering the Turkish in the process. They then take away these territories. Then the Caspian Sea gets affected, where boats go all the way through the Caspian Sea and into this territory right here. These two occupation zones, or the de facto areas of Russia, get meet up, and then the Indians actually join into the war, being at the side of the Russians, taking down these territories over here. Now what's crazier is that the Turkish are also joining the war. So as it turns out, the Turkish really want those precious lands of theirs. Taking down these areas. However, then the old empire comes back with a huge attack. Which then they sent an ultimatum to Turkey, which basically said that they are forced to be a puppet state of the new empire, and in return they will be able to have aid from the new empire. Which, for context, this is what the country looks now. However, these are all of the territories they used to have, including all of India, and including a bit of here. But yeah, basically they lost all of that just because of a war. However, the Turkish end up taking away Cyprus instead of being a puppet state, because they technically still are in the war. However, they're sending troops to Russia instead of sending their own troops to the new empire. Now this area of Russia gets affected by the new empire, as the new empire has an idea, and this idea is the most stupidest thing ever, because they put boats all the way over here, and they got this area, which, mind you, is the worst area there is in Russia, which normally the new empire wants to have like the best areas. However, they thought that the Caspian Sea's borders, or just like everything around the Caspian Sea, has to be rich with oil, right? Well, this area is the poorest area in Russia. Well, you might be asking me, how did I know that? Actually, you don't have to know, because the new empire ends up having these territories now. However, then they lose these territories. The Greeks also have an advantage because since they were pretty close with the new empire. You know where this is going. You absolutely know where this is going. The Greek people are in Turkey. I repeat, the Greek people are in Turkey. Now Turkey's capital in this case is over here, which the Greeks somehow end up getting. Now, as it turns out, the reason why the Greeks easily got the capital was because the Turks were so dumb. They sent every single troop to Russia instead of just a couple troops over here, which the Russians end up encircling this area right here, ending up taking it. They then take away Cyprus and do that. Now, since the Russians are in the border of Turkey, they're able to push back the Greek, which work. They then give Turkey Cyprus. However, the new empire call it quits. However, Russia doesn't give up. As now the Russians are taking the most richest parts of the new empire. They end up taking the Gulf of Persia, taking these areas, and just being cool. However, and since they encircled this part of the new empire with the Indians, the Russians and the Indians end up sharing the land over here. Now, this might be a total collapse for the new empire's citizens. However, as it turns out, many people over here are actually revolting. For example, we have the Somalians over here trying to revolt. We then got these people over here. Which end up revolting. Now they're actually called the United Arab Emirates. Now, I mean, yeah, it does sound like another nation. However, the thing is that it's a huge empire. However, the new empire ends up taking down this empire, which is the newer empire. Which, I'm just kidding. It's just called the newest empire. It's the UAE empire. Don't worry. And then the new empire ends up taking away these territories from Russia. However, then Russia's like, you know what? Let's not fight because this is taking a bit too much. Which the new empire agrees. So in this treaty, you can actually see that firstly the new empire has actually lost a bunch of land. And then we got the Caspian Sea empire over here. Then what's interesting is that, wait a minute, I forgot about this guy. So yeah, basically the Indians take all of their territories over here that they've got, and the new empire ends up being brought by the Turks. These guys that I just talked about, the UAE empire, and the Somali people. However, at least the new empire owns this part of Africa. Meanwhile, we're going to Australia, where you can actually see the very first Australian landing of New Zealand. Now they end up taking the Northern Island. And they then reach all the way to this part, to the Southern Island. However, a revolt happened. This time this revolt sucks, because this is the New Zealand revolt over here, which they actually get the Austin town. I don't remember the capital city of New Zealand. I mean the name. I know what it looks like, but don't know the name. Forgot the name. basically the New Zealand people in the New Zealanders actually hates Australian occupation. Then we have the Indonesian people, which since they're a tribe, they do nothing. However, they have heard that apparently their older territories have been taken, so the Indonesians had a long time to prepare the perfect nation of Indonesia. And yes, Indonesia exists in this world. Now they end up taking Singapore, which is kind of lucky. And what I just remembered, this most popular street over here, they own it now. So basically they end up taking these territories over here, which the Australians hate, so they declared war. However, what they don't know is that the Indonesians are about to cook them, because they now take these areas over here. Okay, phew. I was thinking the recording was cooked, but nah. Oh my god, I was a bit too scared. Oh my god. But yeah, basically the Indonesians end up taking their territories, which during the war they actually gain this territory, which they don't give to the Malaysians because they're already in China. However, thank goodness Brunei wasn't in this scenario, because if they were, 99 out of 100%. I mean, oh my god, I'm so dumb. 9 out of 10 times, Indonesia is about to cook them. Wait a minute. This is the most easiest street. I could just show it to y'all. Let's just say the Indonesians get all of the territories they have gained. That is that simple, bro. That is that simple. They just gain the territories they got. That's actually smart. They just did that, and of course they did that because yeah. However, Indonesia was a bit too ambitious, because let's just say they started colonizing freaking the Philippines, which the Chinese end up joining into the trend, taking these territories right here. Then the Japanese end up taking the largest island of the Philippines, including these two small islands. Now we can see the world like this. However, there's one last thing. The Russians are advancing, and they're advancing quick. Now they ended up taking this part of Siberia. And let's just say this part. Yeah, they also get it for no reason. They just get it. They then get this area, and so yeah, basically they become Russia for no reason. They just become Russia. However, they're not Russia's. They're not Russia just yet, because they still have time to learn. And by the way, did I forget that the Russians get Denmark? However, you know what's surprising? We haven't actually got a Norway country. Which, speaking of a Norway country, okay, here we have it. We just have it. And no, it's not the Vikings. They're not Viking now. They're now actual, Norway people. They're not Vikings. Why would you think that? However, suddenly they actually gained these territories, which the Russians absolutely hate because firstly, why did they even take these lands? Yeah, that is Brazil. Oh my god. I don't know any other color thing I could use. This color is a bit too familiar. Well, not really, okay? So, let's just say the Swedes revolted. which the English then created, which the English then somehow gained a new colony. We should call this colony Newer Found Land, said the British. Everyone else crashing out because of what happened, with Newfoundland. Because both of them have the worst names ever. However, the British already knew that there was a nation over here. However, they didn't want to interfere. So they didn't get Quebec, which wartime, baby. I'm not actually gonna show you the war because it's easy. The French just want to have Quebec because they just feel like it. They just love Quebec. They love Quebec. They just love Quebec. However, the Englishmen decide to go away from Quebec and into more territories they go. Which first we have these territories that they found for no reason. However, it was super cold. Which the British are like, nah, that's average temperature for us. So yeah, they just did it. They just gained these territories because they're built like it. The Englishmen then reach this part, which is the second coldest part of Canada. This part being coldest because it's literally next to the North Pole. So then the Englishmen take this area and this and this and this, and the second they know it, they are a bit too ambitious. They get this. So yeah, now you can see that the British are a bit too ambitious, which I literally just said like 1 billion times. However, the Australian Empire is coming to an end when okay, I think I'm saying a bit too much, like when like that. So oh my god, why am I saying bro? Like, am I an unk? Like come on, I'm doing it again. So basically, the new empire takes away their African colony, which foreshadowing is the richest colony there is in Africa. They abandon it for no reason. However, the Somali people, you know what the Somali people are gonna do? They're gonna freaking colonize the land because they're built like it. So they gain these territories, and the second you know it, they got this whole street. So yeah, I actually think that the Mediterranean is a bit too empty. I mean, it doesn't have any territories that surely the Iberian Union won't do anything suspicious. The Italians are mad. The Italians are freaking mad. They realized that the Iberian Union is colonizing Africa once again, which the Italians hate. So there's a war after the Spanish accidentally gained this territory from Tunisia, thus creating the first war, the first freaking war. It's the first ever war, like ever. I'm just kidding. It's the first African war. Okay, we technically had the before African war. I'm just thinking of a name for this. The Italian-Iberian War. That sounds kind of catchy. So yeah, the Italians pushed back the Iberian Union over here, which they then push into Portugal. And at this point, they get Madrid, ending the war. Well, in this treaty, which okay, why am I saying this a bit too much? But the French got a colony somehow over here, which, okay, I'm no longer saying okay, which the French have a war with the Italians for no reason. They just have a war with the Italians because they just feel like it. And don't get confused with these people. Don't get confused. But the Italians don't even militarize this area. They only militarize this part of Italy. However, the French want to have a more bloody war. A more terrible war. So they attack Sicily. However, the Italians back up. Eventually, the French decide to get a chunk from their de facto occupation. The Brits, of course they do, take down this slither of land over here. Which the reason why they do is so that they could connect their Nigerian part all the way to the Mediterranean, so the Nigerian colony is able to get this. However, they miscalculated, and instead they get this part, which of course the Brits think that this area, of course the British think that this continent is small. So they end up taking away their Nigerian colony, which let's just say new nation. Now, don't get confused with the new empire, because this nation is the Nigerian Union, and the Nigerian Union only exists here. Which, let's just say, they get this. They only get this. They always get this amount of land. Oh my god. Wait, I actually feel bad for this African nation over here, because it literally has no conflict, no allies. The second most radioactive country with the most amount of radiation, and their citizens are emigrating to most of other countries. So the South African country, it ends up abandoning the worst parts, the worst parts of the country, which is the country itself. So now the very first African country over here, or second, I don't really remember. However, yeah, this area, the very first area to get any other people in Africa get taken down by their own government just because. But anyways, the first ever nation over here in all of African history, in the whole PNAU series, has been taken down because of their own government. And instead they immigrate all the way to India, which the Indians allow them to take this island named Sri Lanka, which of course they want to get it. Then the Polish people establish the very first Polish people place thing. Not to get confused with the Nigerian country and the Russians. The Polish gain these territories right here. Now, the French actually realized that since Germany doesn't exist, they could just gain the territories of Germany. However, they were thinking about it, and that is a bit too much. By the way, just letting you know, the French and Italian conflict is still going on. However, nobody is doing that much. So yeah, technically the war is, just bleed. However, the Madagascar country has a problem. Now, since the Somali people over here own this part, they're now poor. So the Madagascar people expect to, lose their Mozambique place because of this. However, no, instead the UAE does. For no reason, they just do that. And take down all of Mozambique, which what the Madagascar people didn't know was that the Mozambique colony over here secretly had treasure. Now that was because rich Madagascar people mostly lived in Mozambique. And to show a treat of respect, the millionaires or even billionaires from the Mozambique colony decided to actually lose all of their money just for the UAE empire to get a huge, economy. However, the new empire is not going great because this happened. So now we can see that this country has taken a bunch of new empire lands. Also with this guy over here, and a bunch of new countries over here. Well, not actually a bunch, but still. So firstly, you have this country over here, which I actually forgot. There's actually a country over here, which I want to call the United Arabic Zone, where every single nation that actually owns a bit of territory from this line, including this territory and this, are like just a single acre of land, and you can join the Arabic Zone. Like everyone from this area, like every single country's citizen that owns this territory, is able to gain access to go to this part. Able to actually visit this land whenever you want. Now, without even an airplane, by the way. So basically, you get a rich boat kind of thing, and then you suddenly go. And by the way, you don't go on airplane. You go on train and boat, including just well, technically airplanes can work. However, it doesn't actually reach the international Arabic zone. It reaches this area over here. Or actually any country except the Arabic zone. So yeah. However, meanwhile, we can see the red country have a new competitor. The blue country. Yeah, that's right. We have red versus blue. The best fight of the life of the blue people. The blue people are revolting. Now the reason why the blue people are revolting, which everyone will scream all the way over here, is because the blue people over here want to take down the Brazilian regime in the areas of Chile and Argentina, making Brazil just Brazil. And this nation also includes parts of Uruguay, or actually most of Uruguay. Which the revolt ends, and basically the Peru country over here decides to abandon most of their territories. And the reason why is because basically the Peru country has to lose territory so that they could start a recreation of themselves. Which they end up being the Mexican country over here. Now the Mexican country basically has all of Central America, which they also discover Baja California. So now the Americans over here are able to take down the Mexicans whenever they want. The end. However, this is actually not the end of this. I was just joking. However, the British, which by the way, this is the final war of the episode, are really mad because the Americans accidentally went into their lands, which there was a war. Okay, that's enough for today. These guys get this. Everyone wins. Goodbye. And this is what the map looks like now. Look. This area is the most populated area because there's now borders everywhere. Unlike this, which has a couple borders. That's just it. And besides, this area doesn't even have any borders. They're just islands. And besides, this area technically has a marine border. This is kind of populated with borders, and India joined the freaking Arabic zone. Plus Poland came. Plus the Iberian freaking Union died. So yay, the world is united to the best world ever. With, side note, nuclear waste.